Good morning, students. We're going to be talking about 1 Samuel 21 today, which is continuing on the story of David and his fleeing from Saul. We just left off when David and Jonathan had devised a plan where they were going to figure out if Saul was unhappy with David and if he was still planning on killing him. Jonathan originally thought that Saul would not be like that, but then after doing the test, it was clear that Saul was still intending to kill David. So David, after hearing this and having the whole incident with Jonathan, he flees and he goes to Nob, which is a location where there is a bunch of priests that are still practicing the correct religious activities that God requires of them. It's about 80 of them. We're going to hear back from this group of people later on. But David flees to Nob, and along with him, he has a large group of fighting men. We're not exactly sure what the number is. We can estimate probably around 300 or so, maybe a little bit less. But David has these men begin to follow him everywhere he goes at this point because he is in a vulnerable position, and these people are fiercely loyal to him. There are situations in the future where violence happens, and these men defend David, and a lot of these guys actually become important generals in David's army and sort of build quite the reputation for themselves. But right now, so David flees to Nob, and he has a bunch of men that come along with him. The flee to him fleeing to Nob was so unexpected that he actually ended up having to not take any weapons with him. He didn't have time. He also didn't have a chance to eat any food. So he arrives at Nob and he asks the high priest at the time if there was anything that he could eat. And the priest says, "Well, we only have the consecrated bread for you." And you would think that this is not a good thing for David to eat. The consecrated bread was a symbol of every day or every beginning of every week on Friday. They would make 12 loaves of bread. They would leave it on a table. And then the 6 of them would go to the high priest and 6 of them would go to the other priests. And if they weren't eaten by the end of the week, then they were offered as a burnt offering to God. So this is a pretty important sort of figure piece in the temple at this time, or where you'd have all the temple, all the priests sort of gathered. And this is actually what David ends up actually eating along with his men because they're so famished. And this idea actually comes up later on in Matthew 12, verse 3 and 4, where Jesus is talking to the Pharisees at the time. And he is asking them that is it lawful or was it lawful for David to eat this food, and what do they think about it? So I'm going to quickly just get that passage up and I'll read it to you. And this is primarily Jesus talking about the idea of the Sabbath day. So he says, so the Pharisees went to him. This is when his disciples had just been picking grains of heads of grain on the Sabbath day. And the Pharisees go to him and say, "Look, your disciples are being unlawful. How could they do this?" And he responds and says, "Well, haven't you read that what David did and his companions did when they were hungry? They entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for priests." And the idea that, or haven't you read in the law that the priests on Sabbath duty in the temple desecrate the Sabbath and yet are innocent? So Jesus is talking about the idea, and this is why it's important. The bread was a symbol of God's bread for the people, but also it shouldn't become so legalistic that people should not understand that it is just bread at the end of the day. And if people can eat it and people need it, then it's reasonable for God to not just be a bread of life in terms of a spiritual wellness for the Israelites, but also a physical wellness. And bread is something you eat. This sort of goes back to that same sort of idea where at the end of the Lord's Supper, back before we had all this pandemic stuff going on, at the end of the Lord's Supper, if there was extra bread left over, it wasn't like we're just going to throw that in the garbage or put it somewhere safe that no one can touch and stuff like that. It's still bread. It's still wine at the end of the day. so people can eat that. It's not being used for the purpose anymore. So then why not use it for what its original purpose is, which is for sustenance? So we get a cool sort of picture into David's mentality, and sort of this idea, this almost Christ-like figure as he's going through, sort of seeing the value in what's in front of him, and also the fact that the priests are willing to give it to David. They do ask before they give him the bread, though, whether his men are ceremonially clean, and David responds that all of his men are clean, so they're willing to give it to him. But it's kind of a cool little point into David's sort of faith life. Now, after this happens, David has been in such a rough situation, actually, that he knows that Nob is not a safe place for him to stay forever. He's able to get some food. He doesn't have any weapons with him, so he actually asks one of the priests, what weapons do you guys have on hand? Any spears or swords? And the priest says, well, we actually only have the sword of Goliath. And David's like, well, I'll take that then. And David flees. He's going to flee to a somewhat surprising place, actually. Which is Gath. Now, if you don't know where Gath is, it's one of the 5 significant cities of Philistia, which are Israelites' sworn enemies. So David flees to Gath. The king Achish is living there. And when he gets there, it seems like people think that they know who he is. And so what he does is he acts like a madman, attempting to sort of make them not think that he's actually David. And he froths the mouth, and he scratches door frames and does all these sorts of weird things, trying to sort of shake them off of his scent that this is actually David. Because if you were a Philistine at this time, you would know who David is. Actually, at one point it says the people are thinking, isn't this that David character? Isn't this the guy that people said that Saul's killed his thousands and David's killed his tens of thousands? So David's a well-known figure at this time. But he is in a desperate situation, and so desperate situations call for desperate measures, and he pretends to be crazy for a while. This concludes this chapter. We'll be talking about the next chapter tomorrow, which is more of the same of David fleeing for his life and trying to really do whatever he can to keep himself alive. Hope this was helpful. Have a good day.